The Family is a comedy crime thriller directed by Luc Besson. So the movie starts with a small Italian family having dinner when they get a knock at the door. But when Daddy goes to answer it, it blows up in his face. And while Pops is sizzling on the floor, Mafia hitman Rocco comes marching in and proceeds to give the rest of the family a bullet-induced nap time. He then lops off one of Daddy's digits and proceeds to mail it to Mafia boss Don Lucchese, thinking that he just took out the family of former Mafia boss turned snitch Giovanni Manzoni. But when Lucchese, who happens to be hanging out in a jail cell these days thanks to Manzoni's snitching, receives the finger and checks the print, he's forced to burst Rocco's bubble and tell him that he just killed the wrong family. And it turns out that the real Manzoni family is in France on their way to Normandy. But not as part of a fun trip to do some World War II sightseeing. Instead, they're being forced to relocate to Normandy as part of the Witness Protection Program, also thanks to Giovanni's snitching. While on their way to their new home, Giovanni's son Warren complains about how long the drive is taking since apparently the car smells like a skunk's butt crack. His daughter Belle blames it on the dog just before his wife Maggie announces that they've finally arrived. After taking a quick look around their new house, Giovanni goes to get the luggage out of the car, where it's revealed that instead of packing a TV or an extra change of underwear, old Gio decided to bring along a dead body. So after apologizing to Sparky for blaming the smell in the car on him instead of the rotting corpse he was hiding in the trunk, Gio proceeds to sneak out back and bury the dead guy in his new backyard before joining Maggie in bed. The next morning, everybody gets ready to start a new day in their new lives, so after sending the kids off to their new school, Maggie goes out to check out the new neighborhood, where she asks the waitress at a cafe if there's anything interesting to do in town, and the waitress is all like, nope. So she decides to head to the store, but when she asks the clerk if they have any peanut butter, he says no and proceeds to start talking shit about Americans in French behind her back. But little does snobby clerk guy know, Maggie actually speaks French, and she doesn't take too kindly to his opinion of Americans. So she does what any reasonable person would do and grabs a propane tank and some lighter fluid and sets it on fire in the back room, and right as she pays for her stuff and leaves, the whole damn store blows up behind her. Meanwhile, at school, Warren gets introduced to the local bullies who immediately give him a grand tour of the bathroom floor. When lunch rolls around, he reveals to his sister that along with getting to know the school bullies, he's also somehow gotten to know pretty much everyone else, and proceeds to give Belle a quick rundown of the who's who while plotting his revenge. Back at the house, Gio decides to clean out the shed in the backyard and finds an old typewriter and immediately gets to work writing a memoir detailing the entire history of his family's life of crime. A little later, when he goes to take a break, he bumps into his neighbor, and when he asks what Gio does for a living, Gio decides to tell him that he's a writer. But when his neighbor asks what he's writing about, he says that he's writing a tribute to the Normandy landings, and claims that that's why he and his family moved to Normandy. Before remembering that he doesn't actually know jack shit about World War II, and quickly makes up an excuse to go back inside. After school, Belle is walking home when 4 pervy dorks from school pull up beside her and offer to give her a ride. She says no thanks, but immediately realizes that she's lost and reluctantly decides to go for a ride in the Dorkmobile. But instead of taking her home, they take her to the lake where they start setting up for some sort of dorky beer picnic. Belle's all like, hey dingus, I asked for a ride home, not a ride to the beach, but Beavis tells her to chillax a bit and starts getting all handsy. So Belle proceeds to grab a tennis racket out of the trunk and tries to use his face as a tennis ball. But apparently they just don't make rackets the way they used to, and once it craps out on her, she decides to commandeer the Dorkmobile and drive herself home. That night, Gio gets a visit from Bob Stansfield, the agent in charge of their case, where he asks how their first day went, and Gio tells him pretty good and says that he decided that he wants his cover story to be that he's a writer. Stansfield approves, but poo-poos all over his war novel idea and tells him to stick to simple subjects before asking him about a shop owner from the last place they were hiding out that went missing right before they left town. Gio tells him that he only remembers the guy from an ass-whooping he gave him after he sold Maggie some bad fish, but says that he has no idea where he is and neglects to tell Stanfield that the guy is actually currently buried in his backyard. Stansfield tells him to behave himself and says that a couple of his agents are going to be keeping tabs on him from across the street. The next day, when he takes a break from his writing, Maggie gets all snippy with him and says that she ain't buying that he's actually writing about the Normandy landings on account of the fact that he doesn't actually know anything about the Normandy landings. So Geo comes clean and tells her that he's actually writing his memoir, and Maggie proceeds to freak out and tells him that it's a horrible idea that's just gonna end up getting them found by the Lucchese's. So she tells him to quit trying to be a writer for 5 minutes and try being a plumber instead, since the water keeps coming out of the tap brown and the guy she called never showed up the 2 times that she called him. Maggie then heads across the street to suck up to the agents that are supposed to be keeping an eye on them by giving them some roasted peppers, where they tell her that Stansfield wants them to throw a barbecue for all the neighbors to help them better blend in the community. Meanwhile, at school, Warren uses his recon from the day before to bribe and blackmail other kids into helping him with his plan to get back at the bathroom bullies. He checks in with Belle on lunch again, where she informs him that she's been having a pretty fun day too, since she had to beat the snot out of some girl that stole her pencil case. She then looks across the cafeteria and sees a nerdy piece of man candy, so she asks Warren about him since he somehow knows everything about everybody. He tells her that his name is Henry and he's a college student filling in as a substitute teacher for math class. Belle, seeing that there appears to be a decent amount of competition for this bespectacled stud muffin, doesn't waste any time and immediately heads to his math class to ask him for private lessons. Meanwhile, outside, Warren gets all the kids he recruited throughout the day to help him beat the piss out of the bathroom bullies. Back at the house, the plumber finally shows up, where Geo answers the door all like, "What the fuck, dude, you're 45 minutes late." And the plumber dude's all like, "Better late than never," which gets Geo pretty PO'd. So when the little plumber douche proceeds to tell him that he's gonna have to replace all the plumbing in his house and it still might not even solve his brown water problem, Geo proceeds to replace the plumber's working legs with broken ones. Later, he gets back to writing his memoir, where he devotes a whole chapter to what a swell fella he thinks he is and how great he thinks he was for his community back in Brooklyn. Meanwhile, Rocco the Hitman manages to track down the buried backyard fish salesman's family and pretends to be an FBI agent trying to help locate him, but really is just trying to see if they know where he can find the Manzonis. And when one of the kids starts asking a few too many questions, Rocco, who has seemingly broken up more families than Maury Povich, decides to just kill all of them and keep looking. The next day, at Geo's barbecue, he has a bit of trouble getting the grill going, and when his douchey French neighbors start being obnoxious about it, he fantasizes about using the grill on them instead. But before he has a chance to do anything stupid, Stansfield shows up and asks him for a drink. While at the bar, he tells Geo that the White House is getting kinda nervous about the book that he's writing, but Geo says that they've got nothing to worry about since he's doing it more for himself than anything else and that he probably won't even end up publishing it. Before he leaves, he tells Geo that a bunch of other mafia guys are now snitching on everybody since they all think that he's off living on a beach somewhere, and it turns out that Geo was the best advertisement that the FBI ever had. The next day, he visits the mayor about his brown water problem, and when Mr. Mayor gets a bit snippy, Geo does a bit more murderous daydreaming before deciding to leave peacefully and continue his little investigation. Which leads him to the water company, where a guy there informs him that there's nothing that they can do about it since the water is already brown when it gets to them, and that apparently it's caused by chemical fertilizers getting into the water. So he heads over to the fertilizer plant, where after the guy in charge gets a bit lippy, Geo proceeds to take him for a little ride down the scenic route. He then persuades him to tell him how to get the fertilizer out of the water, where he tells Geo all he has to do is stop the turbine on one of the chemical tanks back at the plant. Meanwhile, at school, Belle visits Henry after class, where she proceeds to lock the door and then gets him to give her a hand with her extracurricular activities. But Warren isn't having quite as much fun and gets told off by his teacher for not doing his homework, so she gives him 5 minutes to turn something in. So he scribbles down a random joke that he remembers hearing Don Lucchese tell when he met him as a kid, and apparently the teacher really liked it since it somehow ends up in the school paper, where a businessman takes it with him on a flight to America, where through the magic of recycling it manages to find its way to Lucchese, who immediately recognizes the joke and sends his goons to Normandy to find the Manzonis. Later that night, Geo gets a call from the neighbor whose face he fantasized about grilling, and he proceeds to invite Geo to a film debate they're putting on and asks him to lead the debate since they'll be watching an American film, so Geo says that he'll think about it. And since the FBI listens in on all his calls, a few minutes later, Stansfield shows up and tells him that he thinks it's a bad idea and he shouldn't go. But Gio tells him that he thinks it'll help him blend in with his neighbors and convinces Stanfield to go with him to keep an eye on him and make sure that he doesn't say anything that'll get him in trouble. And speaking of trouble, the next day at school, Warren lands himself in hot water when he's hauled in front of the school board and questioned about his many shenanigans and crimes. So he decides to go home and grab his stash of cash and fake IDs and plans to head to Paris to start out on his own since he doesn't want the FBI kicking the rest of the family out of the witness protection program because of him. Before he leaves, he says goodbye to Belle, who's all bummed out after learning that her little love affair with Henry was a bit more one-sided than she thought, and now that his exams are over, he's running off to teach in Paris without her. Meanwhile, Gio sets up a dummy to throw off the feds while he sneaks out to plant a bomb on the turbine at the fertilizer plant to hopefully solve his brown water problem. And after not so sneakily returning home, Stansfield shows up and they head off to the debate where apparently because of some kind of technical glitch with the first movie, they'll now be watching the movie Goodfellas instead. And Stansfield's all like, oh, hell no, but Gio convinces him to stay since it would be even more suspicious if they ran off now. So while they sit there watching a mafia movie, Warren's at the bus stop living a mafia movie because when the bus finally shows up, Hitman Rocco and the rest of Lucchese's goons hop off of it. So he tries to call home to warn everybody, but nobody answers since Maggie's too busy getting herself kicked out of church for giving the priest nightmares with her confession, and Belle's chit-chatting with Henry as she gets ready to throw herself off some random roof since she doesn't seem to be taking getting dumped very well. But before she's able to turn herself into a splat on the pavement, she looks down and apparently recognizes the top of Lucchese's goons' heads, so she calls off her midnight roof jump and heads home. Back down on the ground, Rocco and the rest of the goons stroll into the local police station, and after proceeding to redecorate the place in cop blood, they hop on the computer to find the Manzoni's address, where Maggie has returned home, and after finding it suspiciously empty, she goes across the street to see if the agents know where the kids are. Meanwhile, after the movie, Gio's having a grand old time telling the Frenchies about how accurate the movie was from his experience as a mob boss, and even though they think he's joking, Stansfield gets all bent out of shape about it, so he calls the agents watching the house and tells them to start getting ready to move the family to a new location. And as he does, Gio's bomb goes off at the fertilizer plant, so they head home, and on the way, Stansfield points out that Gio's alibi is a little too good, and while dropping him off, he forbids Gio to leave the house while he goes to the police station to find out what the hell just blew up. After finding out that their little stay in Normandy is about to come to an end, Maggie heads out to find the kids, but as soon as she steps outside, she looks down the street and sees Rocco and friends, so she ducks back inside and warns the agents about the goons currently surrounding the house, where inside, Gio is pretty pleased with himself as he seems to have finally solved his brown water problem just in time for the goon squad outside to turn it into an entire house problem. As the neighbors come outside to see what all the ruckus is about, the goons take them out one by one before doing the same thing to the agents across the street, leaving Maggie alone inside to fend for herself. And right as her day is about to go from bad to worse, when one of the big fat goons pulls out his not-so-big or fat ding-a-ling, Gio, who somehow managed to survive the whole damn house falling on him without so much as a scratch to show for it, sneaks up behind him and proceeds to go for a life-or-death piggyback ride, until Maggie crawls over with a kitchen knife and pops him like a big rapey balloon. Meanwhile, across the street, as the goons are checking out what's left of the house and arguing over whether or not they should kill Snoopy, Belle and Warren finally show up and after borrowing some of the goons' guns, proceed to give them back one bullet at a time. But after Warren uses a gun almost as big as he is to take out the last goon, he gets sent flying by the recoil and takes a nasty bump on the noggin. While Belle goes and helps Warren, she finds out the hard way that Rocco is still alive and well, but luckily he's all out of bullets, so they decide to go for a little jog down the road, where just as he's about to catch her, Stansfield shows up and turns him into a human speed bump. So with all the goons now dead and the family's cover as blown as their house is, they all pile into the car and head off to start a new life somewhere else, as Gio sits in the car and starts to rewrite his memoir all over again.